Have you ever seen a plan, something that looks perfectly sensible on paper, crafted with the very best of intentions, and then just watched it crumble in the real world? It's a curious phenomenon, one we see in human endeavors all over the globe. It seems that a good idea, well, it's just not always enough. And that question, it's not just some academic exercise. It points to a much deeper puzzle about how we function, how our societies are designed, and what invisible forces are really pulling the strings. To get to the bottom of it, we need to look at a case where simple logic ran headfirst into a far more complex reality. Our story takes us to Sri Lanka, and it starts with an environmental policy that seemed like a sure thing. The country, like so many places, was trying to solve its plastic pollution problem. And the solution they came up with seemed, well, it seemed elegantly simple. The objective couldn't have been clearer or more admirable. Cut down on single-use plastics and help protect the environment. I mean, who could argue with that? The logic was completely sound. So the method they chose was a classic move right out of the behavioral economics playbook. The idea was that by charging a small fee for plastic bags, you'd make people stop and think and hopefully encourage them to bring their own reusable ones. You know, it's a tactic that's worked in many places around the world. But here, in this particular ecosystem, it just wouldn't take root. So despite all that sound logic, the policy was a bust. It didn't just fail to meet its goals, it actually created this paradox. A good idea with a good intention somehow led to a really poor outcome. And the reasons why tell us so much about what we usually miss when we're designing these grand plans. So what on earth happened? Well, the public felt like they were being punished for something that wasn't entirely their fault. Meanwhile, the big corporations churning out tons of plastic, they seemed to be getting a free pass. And it turned out the supermarkets were actually making a profit from these new fees, and nobody knew where that money was going. So the noble environmental goal just got completely swamped by a feeling of unfairness. So where did it all go wrong? The failure, it seems, wasn't about the economics or the logistics in the way we usually think about them. It was about something much deeper, something you can't really see on a spreadsheet. To understand this, we have to look past the numbers and into the social fabric itself. And this is where the work of behavioral economist Ahmed becomes so crucial. He looked at policy failures like this one, and others too, like brand new school computer labs being kept locked up, or microloan programs that never got off the ground. And he realized they weren't failing because they were bad ideas. They were failing because the very foundations of trust and ethics in those environments had worn away. Ahmed figured that if these invisible forces were really that powerful, then we needed a way to actually see them, to measure them. So he set out to create a new kind of diagnostic tool, a framework that could somehow quantify the social health of a system before you even try to introduce a new policy. And this is what he created. He calls it the Trust Ethics Nexus, or the 10 formula. Now, I know it looks a bit complex, but it's a remarkably powerful way to make those invisible social dynamics visible. It essentially translates abstract ideas like trust and fairness into variables you can work with to help predict an outcome. All right, so let's break this thing down, because what's really fascinating here is how each little part of this equation represents a critical piece of the social puzzle. The formula is trying to predict the outcome, which is the O, and it does that based on two key human factors. First, you have T for trust. That's basically how much confidence the public has in the people running the show. And then you have E for ethics, that shared, deep-down sense of what's fair and what's right in a society. Now this is the really clever bit. Notice how the formula uses trust multiplied by ethics, not just added together. And that distinction is absolutely crucial. It means you can't just swap one for the other. You can't make up for a policy that feels completely unfair by just having a lot of trust. If either one of those values gets close to zero, the whole thing collapses. They either amplify each other or they cancel each other out. Of course, the real world is messy, and the formula accounts for that. Alpha represents a society's baseline resilience, its natural ability to keep going. X is all about the practical context, things like infrastructure, resources, and so on. And that last one, epsilon, is the error term, which is really just a humble way of saying that in any human system, there are always going to be things that we just can't measure. So, now that we have this new tool, let's go back to our mystery, the failed plastic bag fee in Sri Lanka. Let's apply the 10 formula and see what it tells us. When you look at the policy through this lens, everything just clicks into place. Trust was low. People saw the government as an enforcer, not a partner. The ethics score was low. The policy just felt fundamentally unfair. And the context was weak, with no transparency. So with both T and E scraping the bottom, their multiplied effect just dragged the predicted outcome right down into failure. And that's the real power of this framework. The policy's failure wasn't some random accident. It was, in fact, mathematically predictable. It was encoded in the social dynamics of that environment from the very beginning. And once you understand this equation, you start to see the same pattern everywhere. Why are those brand new computers in the school lab kept under lock and key? It's not about a lack of resources, it's a lack of trust. Why do those microloan programs sometimes fail to help entrepreneurs? So often, it comes down to institutional mistrust. It's the same social equation, just playing out in a different story. So what does this all mean for the bigger picture? Well, the 10 formula isn't just about explaining why things go wrong. It's a new lens for trying to get things right. It's a whole new way of looking at governance, one that focuses on measuring the health of the social ecosystem where a policy has to live or die. And when you look around the world, you can see this pattern writ large. Countries that tend to have high levels of trust and strong social ethics, like Germany, for example, also tend to have much more success with their policies. The social ground is already fertile. On the flip side, in places where trust and ethics are low, like in our case study, new ideas have a much harder time surviving. In the end, it's perhaps best to think of the trust ethics nexus formula as a kind of medical instrument for society. Before you perform a major operation, like launching a new policy, you can use it to check the patient's vital signs. It helps you see if you need to work on building trust and fairness before you even start building the policy. And so perhaps the ultimate lesson here is that the success of our biggest goals might depend less on how clever our ideas are and more on the simple strength of our social bonds. And if we now have a tool that can measure something as profound as trust, it leaves us with one last compelling question. What other invisible forces are out there, shaping our world, just waiting to be seen?